Hello and welcome. We have been fed a steady diet for decades now of the idea that to believe in God is absolutely unreasonable. The idea that there is some detached sky daddy up there watching out for us. And I use that terminology intentionally because those are the terminologies and the verbiage that people use to try to make people feel dumb, if we're honest, for daring to believe that a God might exist. So here's the question that we want to answer today. Is it reasonable to believe that there is a God? So Dan, Clay, let's jump right into this. Dan, is it reasonable, and why is it or is it not reasonable to believe that there's a God?
And see, the operative word in the question is reasonable.
Reasonable.
Is it reasonable? See, it's true that we cannot definitively prove that there is a God, that God exists, but equally true, they can't prove that he does not exist. As a matter of fact, we can find plenty of evidence to support either one. And then at some point we arrive like where you started there with people slandering, saying, well, Sky Daddy.
And that's what we do. We call names.
Yeah,
we make
exactly.
catchy statements and phrases to get people thinking or in a particular narrative. So what do you got for us?
Well, I just want to say I think it is reasonable to believe in God. And there are so many reasons. You know, we can start, you go to a book on systematic theology, for example, and you'll find that for hundreds and hundreds of years, people who had access to printing presses have been printing books on the subject of establishing. So we're not anywhere near the first people, philosophers and theologians alike, who have debated this subject of the existence of God.
Right.
But we get into the cosmological. We just begin to look around a little bit. Everything that exists has a cause, period.
Right.
And
Okay.
we understand that. You know, science proves that out. We come up with theory after theory of why that has to be true. And the universe at some point began to exist. And so it's reasonable to consider, it's reasonable to believe that something caused the universe to exist. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, we know our universe is expanding. And they say it will continue to expand for infinity. I mean, it just won't stop. So you have to look at that and go, okay, well, if it's expanding and it's always been expanding, and so it's been expanding it can't have been expanding for infinity looking back.
Right.
So at some point it had to have a beginning.
Right.
I mean, and science, they understand that now. They have accepted the fact that there is a definite beginning to the universe.
Yeah, and mathematically that's proven. In fact, it's ironic. I was listening to a debate yesterday between Richard Dawkins and a mathematician, a little Irish mathematician. You may recognize him. Anyway, it was really funny because he was saying, what you are asking me to believe, and I would ask, is this reasonable? And this is the cosmological, that argument is what you're asking me to believe is that there was nothing and that nothing produced something, and that's not logical. That's the leap of faith that I would say is actually very illogical, in our thinking, scientifically and otherwise.
And, Dan, you brought up a great point that we can't definitively prove there is a God, but you can't definitively prove there is not a God. But it always amazes me when you see some of these debates between science and other people that believe in God, and the scientist is, they can't, when they run into something they can't explain or they can't prove.
Right.
The one thing they're certain of is that it's not God.
Right.
Well,
right. And that is intellectually dishonest.
Yeah,
And,
you don't know what it is, but you're certain that when you figure it out. Because I heard one scientist actually say this, no, we haven't figured that out yet, but we're certain when we do, the answer won't be God. Well,
and see,
that's intellectually dishonest.
We land at so many places where, we argue that everything that exists because of something else that happened. Everything exists for a reason. And so to deny that and to hold on to that as your philosophy in life, that everything did come from nothing, that something did come from nothing even, is far more difficult, for me anyway, far more difficult to believe than something must have created this.
Because it is unscientific, and our minds, for whatever reason, are wired or programmed for reason. Reason actually shouldn't exist in a material world, yet here we are with a mind that is capable of reasoning, and I believe that's because it's made in the image of the Creator, and that would make perfect, reasonable sense. That's why I say it's perfectly reasonable to believe that there's a God, because you have to be, anything that is here must exist because of something greater. That's why I look and say, actually, you cannot prove that there is not a God, but our very existence is undeniable evidence, in fact, that anything exists, that there is material, that there is intellectual, that there is anything that is metaphysical or physical is evidence, and I would say concrete evidence, and you may not call that God Jesus, but it is evidence that something didn't come from nothing, which we know is a scientific impossibility. So you're asking, is it reasonable? I believe actually it is any thinking man or woman will come to the conclusion that it is actually unreasonable, and to observe anything actually is evidence for the existence that something created everything. Otherwise, where does it come from? But to hear these two guys talking, I refer back to the debate that they were having. Dawkins said, the other gentleman said, he said, what is your definition of nothing? He said, well, it's nothing. He said, because a lot of people now say that there was really not nothing, there was just something else. And for him to say that there was absolutely nothing that birthed all of this something, again, is an absolute irrational, perspective. So Dan, what else do you have?
Well, let me just say this. If you could show me how, you could take a box full of letters and shake it real good and let it all fall out, and it turns into poetry that moves somebody, or it turns into a great screenplay or stage play. Right. I will be more apt to believe that, yes, somehow all of this just magically appeared, and as well tuned as even our hand is.
That's exactly another reason.
That comes to it. Not just that it exists, not just that there was a beginning and now it's all here, but the fine tuning of it all. The fact that if you look at just a position of the earth, if the earth was just a few degrees further away from the sun or closer to the sun, life wouldn't be possible. It would be too cold or too hot, depending on which direction. You look at the gravitational forces, you look at everything and how it works together.
And it's conducive for human life, for life period.
Exactly. It's not just, we took a box with a bunch of letters and shook them up and dumped out a bunch of letters. Which that even, really would have to be a box full of nothing.
Yeah, because where do you get the letters to start with? The dumping.
The fact that well, it's not just, we didn't just have all this stuff appear in randomness. It is fine-tuned in ways that just, if you're intellectually honest, you realize it's not feasible or possible.
So you're talking about the fine-tuning
of the universe.
Not that it just came from nothing, which would be unreasonable, but it not only came from nothing, it is ordered according to laws.
That
where
makes
did the laws
it
come
even
from?
more reasonable when you look at it. So if you say everything came from nothing, fine, but how did everything come from nothing perfectly fine-tuned?
Okay, so you're saying it's unreasonable to believe that nothing threw up a bunch of something and threw up laws to govern that something at the same time. Is that?
Absolutely. Guys, we laugh.
No, absolutely.
There's a Christian author that wrote a book, and he does conferences. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
Right.
If we stop and think about it, it's more of a stretch to believe some of this stuff. And I go back to, and I've got it here, a quote by Thomas Nagel, who is a very intelligent man, highly educated, and he says, "I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent, well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right. in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God.
Right. Now that that makes sense. And so when you have that presupposition and you're faced with the logic and the reason, I mean,
that I don't want that to be true. So therefore, I'll shape things to match what I want to be true.
And that is the kind of counter argument of somebody who says, well, you were raised in a Christian home and you want that to be true, and therefore you come to that conclusion. Well, that works both ways. What you're saying there that he's admitting is exactly the opposite. He's raised in an atheist home. He doesn't want the accountability. He doesn't want it to be true. Dan?
And see, I think the same thing, that we could argue, or people could argue against us in the same way. Well, you were raised with that as your foundation. Well, yeah, that's true. And let me tell you, I honestly marvel at scientific discoveries, and I'll follow them up to a point, and sometimes they kind of veer way off to the unbelievable left somewhere.
Right, when they start extrapolating.
But as I see that the things that we discover and the things that we learn about how we're created and how it's all put together, man, that's amazing to me. But explaining doesn't fix everything. Having an explanation. I mean, just take sitting next to a still body of water, a still lake or a pond, and seeing the reflection of the sun. You can see what the sun is, and you can experience what it's doing, but it doesn't explain how the sun is still here generation after generation after generation, how it still does what it does. But when you get down to the creation and the why of it, the why of the sun, the why of the universe in its organization, the why of the ionosphere and all the other ospheres that are between us and that sun, protecting us and making even the amazing discoveries of radio wave communication possible.
Yes.
It's just too unfathomable. I can't even say the word.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to believe that this
today.
all just happened.
Yeah.
I can't get on board.
And another thing that makes it totally reasonable is you and me. To think that everything that we are sitting here in these chairs right now was predetermined by a language that was written within the context of the first cells that were generated, when we came into being at conception. And that's when life starts, by the way, conception. In fact, that's the definition of conception, in case you're wondering. Anyway, so the DNA strands carry the longest words, the longest written. This is information. Information existed. So I believe it is absolutely intellectually dishonest, and scientists are saying this by the droves now. They're saying it's intellectually dishonest to believe that something came from nothing. It came with governing laws. We evolved from nothing to what we are, when what we are now is an intricate code that if you changed one letter of, would not turn you into a superhuman mutant. It would make you dead. See, that's one of the myths.
Not only that, but you look at the fact that we have no scientific record of, we have single cell organisms, right? And then we have complex organisms. We don't have the intermediate.
Right, and even those single-cell organisms are incredibly complicated. It's not just a single cell.
Right, but you don't have the intermediate. There are no two-celled organisms.
Right.
We don't have a record of it. We don't have three-celled organisms.
Right.
So to say now it's reasonable to believe that this single-cell organism, as complex as it may be, turned into
spontaneously with double the information somehow.
To all of these different expressions of organisms we see now, that you think about all the different animals, and you think about all the...
Yeah.
That started with, now to get there, you already had to make the leap that life came from non-life. There's so many stretches
that is unreasonable. We have never seen that. That is absolutely unreasonable. Again, we're talking about reasons to believe in God, not reasons to believe in unbelievable propaganda.
Is it reasonable? So again, is it reasonable to believe that something came from nothing? Okay, you have to make that one.
Right.
Then you have to go, well, not only did something come from nothing, but now life came from non-life.
Right.
And now the single cell life somehow, with no evidence or proof of anything intermediate, somehow became complex life. So it didn't just become a different single cell organism or a two cell, but it became dogs and cats and snakes and
well, why don't we just say
humans
this? This would be more reasonable, that the nothing that spewed or puked out the something that was ordered, what if it just went ahead and puked out or spewed out the something already complete? Like, instead of puking after the nothing is going to throw up something, why would it just throw out the base components? Why not just throw out the finished clay?
Well, but then
or the finished dam.
But then
that would make just as much sense, right?
Right.
Because it's obviously a smart nothing that's creating all the something that is fine-tuned. I'm just being reasonable. I mean, when you run this to its end.
Well, you're right. I mean, and we kind of laugh about this because it
just makes so much sense.
It does seem absurd. But again, we have to go back and realize that being intellectually honest, if somebody's coming from a standpoint of they don't want there to be a God, because if there is a God, then that means I'm accountable to that God.
Yeah.
See, that's why, and people realize this, that's why they don't want things like intelligent design, which is a compromise.
Right.
Okay. They don't want that taught in the schools alongside the hypothesis of evolution.
Okay.
Because it can't be proven. Anyhow, they don't want it taught alongside, because once you go to, okay, there is an intelligent designer. Okay, now you have to answer the question, okay, who is that intelligent designer?
Right.
Because it matters. It makes a difference. And so if I don't want there to be a God, I'm going to look for the evidence to prove that, or to make me feel better in denying that God exists.
Right.
See, and that's pretty much the thing, with all the discoveries. Again, I marvel at science,
Right.
And when you go back just to the discovery of DNA and how that worked together and how that strand of information feeds all of life and guides all of life, science, they found it. They came up with it. They told me about it. But I look at that and I see, well, how can you not believe then? And it comes down to what you just said. We said it a couple times. I don't want to believe there's a God. I don't want there to be a God, because that brings us to the moral argument of right and wrong and good and bad. But every one of us, we stand on these principles of truth and justice and all these things. Our cultures are built on these things.
Right.
And everyone who argues against a moral authority, a designer to whom we're accountable, they all stand for those same principles. They all stand for morality.
And that's
they all
cheating.
stand for justice.
Right.
And so they're not being intellectually or morally, in that case, what's the word?
Honest?
Responsible.
Yes, responsible.
They're not being responsible to that. They're not being honest.
Well, that is one of the biggest arguments that you just talked about. The universal morality that is not physical. It's not observable and touchable. It's not material. And a lot of people who would deny that there was a God would say there's nothing beyond what we can see, touch, and feel. Yet everything, that universal evidence of a consistent morality should be evidence of the residual effects of something that placed something inside of every human being. Mm-hmm. I know we're talking about good reasons. Is it reasonable to believe that there's a God? And I think we've given some good ones. Let me give a little different slant to why I believe it's perfectly reasonable. One, there are millions upon millions upon millions of people in history and currently living who say they have experienced God. And when we talk about that, we're talking about specifically the God of the Bible, who have had encounters, personal encounters with Jesus. There are millions of people who say they have experienced miracles or the miraculous. Now, that means that something come in that is beyond natural circumstances or situations and occurred. There are people who seek and desire something that shouldn't exist. Well, you're talking about truth. There are people who experience something that shouldn't exist, peace. There are these things that exist that are, again, we talk about the ghost in the machine. I was talking about this recently, and the scientists have always kind of been befuddled with the idea that you have a consciousness, an awareness, a part of you that is different or disconnected or somehow not subject to the body. We see, scientific evidence and testimonies of people who had what we refer to as out-of-body experiences, or their brain waves were completely dead, yet that person was aware of everything everybody was saying in the room. And are these scientific anomalies, or are these evidence proofs, obvious proofs, that there is something outside of the material world? And I believe that it is reasonable to believe that if there is a material world, the impossibility that could be there with nothing else existing it's unreasonable to believe that. Now, the Bible tells us, and I believe that this is perfectly reasonable, that invisible things that really exist created the visible things that we now see. That makes perfect sense. If you say there's nothing there, then that's illogical, that's unreasonable. Not only in my opinion, but in any thinking man's, opinion. I look around and go, well, the evidence of God. And that's why the Bible says you can look, and creation itself bears witness of the existence of God for anybody who will sit down and think this thing through for 3 minutes.
The interesting part is that the argument typically, and I hate to boil this down in this way, but the argument typically is against Christian believers.
Right.
People don't argue the existence of God with Jews, but you take Jesus out, take Jesus as the way, the truth, and life. You take that out. He died for our sins. Okay, that's off the table. Now you back up to God. Well, you can still argue with others of whether or not God exists, but if you do that, now you're alienating Buddhists and every other pathway, if you will,
right,
to God, pathways to reason why we are here. Everybody can't be wrong.
Right.
We look at science and there's some great stuff there, but it does not, none of it answers how this all came into existence.
Or contradicts the existence
it's simply
of God.
unreasonable to believe it all came from nothing.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I want to just kind of shift for just a second on this, because we're talking about, is it reasonable to believe in God? But I mean, it should be obvious, but let's be clear, we're talking about believing in the God of the Bible.
Yes.
And I was just sitting here kind of looking at some of the notes. We have to remember, in our current modern context, we understand, we look at the Bible as it's one book, because that's how we're used to seeing books.
Right.
It's not. It's 66 books written across 1,500 years in 3 different languages by multiple authors, and it tells a consistent story from beginning to end.
Historically verifiable.
Right.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you look at okay, for example, the Quran, written by how many people?
One.
Over how long? Yeah. Okay.
1 year.
Exactly. So you look at
Who threw out half of the original Quran? Just throwing that out there.
Exactly. So you have to look at that and go, okay, not only is it reasonable to believe that there is a God, but it's if you start to really look at things, it becomes very reasonable to believe that the God of the Bible is the God of that it is who he says he is. There are very few people out there, even in the scientific world, very few skeptics left that deny the historical accuracy of the New Testament.
Right.
There's just too much extra biblical evidence that supports it. Archaeology is still today, they're still making discoveries. All these 2,000 years later and even longer in some cases that support what we find recorded in the scriptures.
Yeah, validating.
Archaeologists, when they're looking for a new place, a lot of times they'll go to the Bible, they'll go to the Old Testament to try to, where's the next place we should look?
Right. Yeah. With all of this evidence, I'm going to say this, and I won't validate, pick this apart, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm crazy. But I think when it comes down to it, the best answer, the most reasonable answer for the existence of everything we see is that something greater exists. The law of thermodynamics, from a scientific perspective, from every perspective, I believe that God is the most logical, most reasonable, and the best answer for why anything is here. What do you think?
I think it's good. I think we live in a world where we've gotten really good at imitating Alex Trebek. We insist that everything be answered in the form of a question. You know, and it's good. It's good for us to question, but it's good for us to stop when we get to the answer every now and then.
Right.
You know, that'd be
but
great.
what if we don't like the answer? And I think that's what we're saying.
And as we have heard admitted, you know, by chief atheists, you know, well, I don't want there to be a God. Well, then we just keep going.
But you're not God, so your want to doesn't dictate reality, except in certain, you know.
That's where I was going to go. I was going to add one more. You were talking about reasonable, and I was going to add one more term to that.
Okay.
Uncomfortable.
Okay.
Because if there is a God, then I have a responsibility. I'm accountable to somebody other than myself. If there's something greater than me out there, then I have to answer. That means I'm going to have to answer to that God at some point.
Right.
And my flesh wants what it wants.
Right.
It doesn't want to be accountable to. I mean, think about it. It's hard sometimes to be accountable to other people, right? And we don't want that accountability. We don't want there to be consequences. That is what it comes down to.
Right.
Consequences to our actions.
And at the same time, when we're the ones on the bad end of the right and wrong, we want others to be accountable for that thing that we don't believe could possibly exist, because why would it?
Right. Yeah.
So I don't really mean to make fun, because there are people who seriously have a problem with all this,
right.
You know, and they need to know the truth, and I can't quit telling them.
Amen. I love that. So, religious experiences, answers to prayers, transformation in lives. My life is a testament.
Yeah.
The experiences that I've had with God have transformed me. Universal longings that are inherent to humanity. The desire to have and answer the question, why, is an indicator that there is an answer there. You know, when I want you folks who are watching to understand this, that you don't have to be shamed. You don't have to be allow people to convince you that it is unreasonable, because when you start to hear the reasons why people object, it really scientifically and otherwise begins to break down very, very rapidly. Unfortunately, the inclination of humanity from history and the very beginning, as documented in the Word of God, tells us that man has an aversion to the accountability to God. He wants to be a God unto himself. Problem is, we don't have the resources. We're all headed towards eternity. We're all going to die one day, and we all acknowledge that. And we can really, really hope there's nothing on the other side. But the other side has told us emphatically, there is something over here. Your existence is the evidence of that, and that is perfectly reasonable. Dan, closing thought?
You know, if you don't arrive at the same conclusion that we do, you're messing up the ends of a whole lot of movies, or the points where we talk about they're watching down on us from above. But, you know, the proofs will never be absolute. Not in this life. They will not be absolute. But the evidence strongly suggests that it is not just reasonable, but very, very plausible that there is something that exists. There was something that created all of this other something in the world.
The best explanation. Clay?
I would just, if you're seeing this and you're not sure, or you don't believe that God exists, I want to challenge you, because you've got nothing to lose. I mean, if you're right and we're wrong, you've got nothing to lose. But just ask God, if you're real, reveal yourself to me.
Yeah.
Again,
That's good.
if we're wrong, you've got nothing to lose.
Yeah.
But if we're right, you've got eternity to gain.
And if you're unwilling to say that, there's a deeper problem that you
Absolutely.
really need to address.
Absolutely.
Amen. You know, as I'll end by saying this, I'm going to quote somebody else who said it this way: I do not have enough faith to be an atheist. Okay? I believe I'm way too reasonable to believe in some of the atheistic ideas and ideologies that have been propagated and been used and leveraged to shame very reasonable, intelligent men and women all throughout history into believing something that is just not true. All right, so don't hide from God. You look for Him because He's been looking and reaching for you for a long time. He's not out there hiding somewhere. He's one ask away. As Clay said, ask and you shall receive. Ask that God will reveal Himself and see what happens. We'd love to hear what comes of that. All right, God bless you. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Practical Discipleship.